As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Male identified parents and the postpartum, about 1 in 10 gets postpartum depression. And not just they're like a little down, they have major depressive disorder with peripartum onset. About roughly 4 to 18% will develop some kind of anxiety disorder. And again, not just, oh, I'm stressed and, adjusting to this. Generalized anxiety, OCD, PTSD, acute stress, like an actual anxiety disorder in the postpartum period.
That was Danny Singley on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 4 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
I'm here with Michael to introduce today's episode with my good friend and clinical psychologist, Danny Singley, who came on to talk to us about a topic somehow in over 300 episodes we've never touched on before, which is the mental health of men and dads specifically. So obviously for this interview, we're going to be using gendered language, and I'm asking questions about kind of men's issues. And so this is for anyone who identifies as a man. And when we talk about women, it's anyone who identifies as a woman. So Michael, what was your reaction to this episode?
Yeah, this was very interesting for me. It was kind of on 2 extremes. One is the topic of being a dad and the struggles, the challenges that come with being a dad, being in a relationship, and the role models and all of that stuff, to which I could relate because I'm not a dad. This was something that was had me nodding, and I was like, this is interesting. This is really interesting. This is happening to people. Wow. It gave me a look into people's lives that everyone is going through that I had no idea was happening. So that was really interesting. And the other extreme was the examples that Danny gave, where I was like, yeah, I've heard this so many times from clients that I work with, that there might be a dad that I'm working with who says, that I didn't have a role model in my own dad. He was a good dad, but he wasn't a role model. He didn't teach me how to do things out there in life. And I want to learn how to work on this for myself, setting boundaries, being a good communicator, being a role model to my own sons, and be the person they come to when they struggle. And I want to learn all of those things. Those were the parts he talked about that I could very much relate to, because I see that everywhere all the time, up to and including the SNL sketch you folks were talking about in there as well, which is one of their most hilarious things they've ever produced on that show.
Yes, it's funny. Those SNL sketches seem to come up a lot on episodes. I talked about one with Emily Nagoski, and Danny and I talked about this one where the girlfriends feel like they have to take their boyfriends out to be social with each other, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Yeah, I hope that this is a hopeful episode for anyone, even if you're not a man or a dad. If you are a man, you might be a dad someday. If you're a mental health professional, you're working with men and dads or future dads. And I think there were so many things to think about here, just in terms of going back to what you were saying about the role modeling is, if you didn't have a dad or you had a dad that didn't model these things for you, and we live in a culture where men aren't exactly supported in wanting to be more involved dads or wanting to kind of get past some of these toxic masculinity kinds of ideas. They want to be different, and there's not a model for that, and there's not cultural support for that. And so I just love what Danny is doing. He's really trying to kind of rewrite the script and create a context that makes it a lot more possible for men and dads to learn and to really grow.
And I will say that if you are a man listening who's not a dad, this is a great episode to show you how you can support your dad friends in your life with what they might need, where they might need the support, where they maybe need a little bit of a nudge. And maybe the one nudge you can give them is to send them to this episode and be like, hey, I listened to something really interesting here. Give it a listen and let me know if this rings true for you.
Yeah. And Danny has all sorts of resources that he talks about too, that are really kind of one of a kind options. And, I've sent male partners of some of my clients to his dad's group, his men's group. And a lot of these guys that join his men's group, they stay for a long time because they get so much out of it, where there's like permission to talk about things in this context that don't exist otherwise. So we hope you share this episode with the men in your life and enjoy my conversation with Danny Singley. Hey, everybody, it's Jill here. And I am super excited about my guest today because my guest, Dr. Danny Singley, is not only an amazing board-certified psychologist, but he is also one of my dearest friends. Dr. Danny Singley is a San Diego-based psychologist and director of the Center for Men's Excellence. His research and practice focus on men's mental health with a particular emphasis on reproductive psychology and the transition to fatherhood. Dr. Singley won the American Psychological Association's 2017 Practitioner of the Year Award from the Division on Men and Masculinities. He is past president of the APA section on positive psychology and is currently the president of the APA Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities and the President's Advisory Council for Postpartum Support International. He conducts trainings and presentations around the country to assist individuals and organizations to enhance their level of father inclusiveness and founded the grant-funded Basic Training for New Dads, Inc. nonprofit and Padre Cadre social networking application just for dads in order to give new fathers the tools they need to be highly engaged with their infants as well as their partners. In his free time, Dr. Singley likes to cook, surf, read, and trick his 2 teenage sons into activities so they can't escape his annoying, shrinky questions. Welcome, Danny, to Psychologist Off the Clock. I'm so super excited to have you here.
I am really amped. I've been super excited and honored that you invited me, and yay.
We'll try not to get too weird like we sometimes do when we have behind the scenes conversations, but this is Psychologist Off the Clock, so you never know. But I really wanted to have this topic. I realized that in our, I don't know how many episodes we've had, somewhere between 350 and 400, I think. We've never had an episode devoted specifically to men and men's mental health and fatherhood. And we've had a number about gender, about race, about all sorts of different kinds of, niche topics like that. So I thought that we could start with why it's important for us to talk specifically about men's mental health.
I definitely want to talk about that. In the way of contextualizing that point, I would first say that drawing attention to the psyche of men and men's issues, it's incredibly important because although a lot of the sort of tropes and stereotypes and kind of social learning we have about men and boys are around, toughness and he can handle it and so forth, does turn out that male identified people are still just people. And in the current cultural zeitgeist, looking at Me Too and Time's Up and a lot more attention to LGBTQ and gender nonconforming and focusing a lot on gender, oftentimes where I'm coming from is, well, let's include everyone. But the part that makes it a bit controversial is often, particularly me, like, right, I'm a cishet white dude and have all the, aspects of privilege that I look like I do. And that doesn't discount to me the importance, certainly for us as psychologists and mental health practitioners broadly, but I would say people in general, to have a more in-depth, a more multi-dimensional way of understanding what's going on for men and boys.
Yeah, it's interesting to even use the word controversy. And it reminds me of when someone says, okay, well, there's a Women's History Month and there's a Black History Month. Why isn't there a History Month for men or for white people? It's like, because every month is for men and white people, right? When you're in the majority culture, every month is for this group of people. And so that makes sense, right? That we need to pay special attention to groups that have historically been marginalized. And, there are also these unique issues that are faced by men that when we don't attend to them, it's maintaining a lot of the problems that are part of being in a patriarchal society. So what would you say are unique issues that are faced by those who identify as men, and how might they present differently from other genders?
Okay, so I realize I'm doing this again. I'm going to answer that question, but I want to go back to the point you made about, Black History Month or Women's History Month and when is Men's History Month or like that. And folks rightly say, well, those have been the ones that wrote all the history. And so everything's about, men and white people and so forth. And I don't disagree with those points. However, one of the major issues that I see contributing to men's marginalization of others and their own restriction in a variety of ways is having those aspects of their identities be sort of tacit and invisible, right? And when you look at any kind of identity development studies that look at power and privilege and marginalization, the ones that have the power and the privilege, particularly when it is just conferred by, I turned out a guy or I turned out white, the usual approach is to downplay or ignore that aspect. I don't see color, said no person of color ever. But hearing that sort of, and it's sort of the same thing about, well, why would we want to draw attention to men or I don't know about men's history, but basically like, is it all of mental health about them and developed by them? And in many ways, yes. However, by turning essentially a blind eye to the fact that men and boys and male identified people are just people. And we do have specific, like the APA released, 5 years ago, the guidelines on working with men and boys. Too much fanfare with lots of pushback. Why are you doing this? Why aren't you focusing on other more marginalized groups? Because it's needed. Because by saying, well, we shouldn't even be looking at that, we are contributing to the same dynamic, which says, hey guys, don't think about your guyness in anything but like a kind of lampoonish Hollywood, I jump out of planes and shoot people and all this kind of way. Like, to me, stopping and really rooting and saying, what does it mean to be male these days? And how is that playing? So to the question that you actually asked me, what we see more than anything are relational concerns, identity questions, and then, what we think of as garden variety, depression, anxiety, substance issues, all sorts of different kinds of mood and anxiety concerns. One of the ways that this plays out for us in our clinic, right? So we are at the Center for Men's Excellence, which just hearing it, some people cringe. They're like, oh, it's a bunch of like, pro-patriarchy men's rights folks over there. I'm like, no, actually, that's what we're working on. Men's help seeking has typically been atrocious, right? So the research around men's help seeking, in particular men's mental health help seeking, to me has been a substantive contributor to men dying 5-6 years younger than age-matched women. And I don't think that's biologically inherited. I think that's socially trained, right? Be strong, don't complain, blah, blah. And so one of the initial issues that we deal with at our clinic is how do we even make this psychotherapy for men and boys and the people that care for them, how do we even make that more approachable? So our branding was one piece of that. We're talking about men. Now, the reality is in our clinic, we see men, we see females, we see trans and queer and gestational trans dads, for example. Like, we see people of all genders. So it's more accurate to say that we're very focused on gender in a person's life and the psychotherapy relationship than it is to say we're just only about men and boys.
Let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Like, when you talk about the branding, what you're basically saying is, if we had called this the Center for Men with Mental Health Problems, nobody would have ever shown up at the door, right? The Center for Men who have anxiety and depression, forget it. They're not showing up at the door. But if you brand it as a Center for Men's Excellence, because of the cultural messaging that people internalize, it makes it like men feel more okay about saying, okay, maybe I can go to this place and actually admit that things aren't going exactly right for me because of the way that you're branding it.
Exactly. And so, as you know, I come from a strengths-based and positive psychological frame, which means we always balance. How do we, identify correct diagnoses and really sort of try to understand the areas of difficulty and deficit and remediation? But alongside that, in any initial treatment plan with me or with one of our clinicians, there's also a clear explication of what are your strengths, what do you do well, what do you want to take from good to great and from great to perfect? Because being less depressed or less anxious, that's not well-being. Like, thriving has a lot more going on than that. And so, yes, men excellence, we're not talking about, playing to not lose. We're talking about playing to win. And that kind of a frame absolutely plays into traditional masculinity ideology in some of those lessons. And then in terms of presentation, so you told me not to get jargony. So I'll get jargony and then I'll so for example, a lot of guys will show up with some flavor of alexithymia, right? Which in the literature we call normative male alexithymia, even though people of any gender can experience it. But so A without lexi, words, thymia, feelings, without the words for my feeling. And a lot of our clients will show up with some version of this. And it's not just one way of showing. So for example, to me, the most profound presentation for an alexithymic client starts with, I have no contact with my inner emotional affective experience. I'm disconnected from it. I don't know that it's in there. I certainly don't know how to articulate what it feels like or how to name those emotional aspects. And I'm certainly not telling other people. So to me, that is the most profound. And for some of those folks that present in that way, it's the beginning of it is connecting with that part of themselves, finding ways to actually get past the externalizing and the I'm pissed off, I'm mad, I'm angry, cool. All that stuff keeps you externalized. Now we're going to balance that with some internalizing frames. Where's the hurt? Where's the sadness, the shame? Up from there, you get folks who they could feel it, they just don't know what it's called, and they're sure as hell not telling anybody about it. Up from there, you have the ones they are connected to it. They do know how to say helpless, hopeless, jealous, rejected, sad, ashamed, but they are not going to tell anyone about it. And that's the way the sort of without words bit plays out. So alexithymia is a really common way that men will present with a bunch of other aspects of their mental health. So-called masked male depression, where some guys will show up with depression that's less characterized by sort of weepiness or kind of rocking back and forth or not getting out of bed or not going to work. It's more about sort of anger and irritability and being withdrawn, which doesn't mean you're not around people. It just means you're not connecting. Most of their relationships are very superficial. The third bit is these masked male depressive guys will oftentimes be drinking or using more drugs but it's more about sort of dopaminergic activities that get their cerebral joy juice going. So it might be video games, it might be risky sex, it might be shoplifting or gambling or jumping out of planes or whatever the thing is. And it's knowing how to actually connect with and identify what's going on with these folks instead of like, whoa, he's just kind of dysfunctional and a butthead. It's like, wait, this is a common depressive. And then the anxiety thing is, what could be less traditionally manly than anxiety? I'm afraid. I have worry. Don't even get me started on having needs in relationships, because that makes me needy. And this is, at least from an interpersonal psychotherapy perspective, one of the most common presenting, like, maybe it's not the presenting issue, but it's a very important dynamic, which is a lot of these boys and men, because we've taught them, be the lone wolf, be tough, don't need anybody, be the big shot. They really struggle with balancing their independence and their interdependence in a variety of different relationships.
How so? What do you mean by that? Interdependence and independence?
Think about this in the context of a new-ish adult male friendship, a platonic friendship. So it's tricky. It's hard not to against this sort of like heteronormative kind of sexist sounding land as I'm using these examples. But a lot of times for folks in their mind's eye, because we've all received similar facets of the training, like it's easier to picture. But so if you imagine, like, a lot of the guys that I work with are expectant or new dads. So they're moving into the reproductive period or maybe struggling with it. And for a variety of different reasons, along that trajectory, a lot of these dads become fairly isolated and they fall into the trap. And this is another common presenting issue. They fall into the trap of trying to get all of their closeness and connection and emotional intimacy needs met by their partner. And no matter how great he, or they are, that's just not going to work. They will end up being dissatisfied and usually, ironically, resenting the partner.
And then maybe especially so once a baby comes along.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so imagine the scenario in which one of these dads, let's say you're a year postpartum and he's like, I'm actually not like seeing friends, and I actually like go to this park and there's another like cool looking dude there that seems like, whatever it is. The balance between independence and interdependence is built into, how do I ask this guy for his number? Because as soon as I do that, I am giving him clear sense that I want to be connected, that I want to be interdependent, that I have some kind of friendship need that relates to him.
Right. And that's the opposite of the lone wolf messaging.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Guys are great at independent, usually to a fault, right? It's how do I balance in a relationship independence and interdependence, where I'm able to clarify what are my needs as they relate to you and my understanding of yours as they relate to me. Another way it's played out is in romantic relationships. For some of these guys, it's very, very tricky when their partner wants more independence. Mm-hmm. And it causes them to feel alone or rejected or isolated. This balance of independence and interdependence, particularly as gender roles are shifting. Because if I have a need that involves you, well, that just makes me needy. And what could be worse for a guy?
But I have to wonder, like, for all of the people who are brave and take that risk, how many of the person who's being asked for the number is like, oh, thank God, somebody wants to hang out with me. What it reminds me of that came up in my session today is I was remembering a long time ago, the very first time I went to New York City. And New York City has this reputation that everybody's mean and rude and nobody wants to talk to you. And I'm walking around the streets making eye contact and smiling and saying hi to everyone. And instead of them giving me the side eye, they all would like look up and be like, oh my God, hi. Like they were so yearning, like so longing for the friendly interpersonal eye contact connection. But because everyone makes an assumption about the way things are culturally, that no one was doing it. And it just makes me wonder, like, how often that would be the case if men were able to kind of break out of those societal rules and expectations and do the interdependent thing, that probably more often than not, the reaction would be, oh, hi, right? Like, let's be friends, you know?
You are so right. And I've seen this over and over again. So it was, I think, mid last year that the US Surgeon General actually released a report on what he called the epidemic of loneliness in this country. And I see that again, if I'm going to take kind of unfair, overly broad, straight out of central casting sexist training, men and boys are trained to have a bunch of superficial relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of going deep and having deeper connections, certainly right off the bat, in virtually any culture, the top level way to be, and this is important, traditionally masculine is anti-femininity, which doesn't mean you hate women. It means whatever it is to be feminine in your culture, the number one top way to be masculine is just don't be that.
Right.
And so then you start looking at, okay, what does that mean? And in many ways, being really like guy has a very sort of reactive and kind of, well, dodgy frame to it.
And of course, perpetuates misogyny as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that point that you're making, though, like I've worked with at this point, like thousands of men and dads. And one of the things that we do at our clinic is we do men's process groups. So they're not support groups, right? They're supportive, but they also involve respectful challenge. The whole point of interpersonal process groups is it's like a little social laboratory. And the guys come in and they all have some flavor of difficulty, depression, anxiety, substance issues, phase of life, relationship, but they all have difficulty connecting with others, be it deepening existing or forming new friendships in particular, or relationships, but in particular friendships. And not just these guys, in doing the work that they do in terms of like stuff that we look at in group, like when he said that, what was that like for you? Or what came up with you? Or you look like you're not saying something over there. And so we kind of try to bring all that to the fore so that then they'll go out and do it. I mean, if you don't get hung up on just the first interaction, right? Because a lot of times one of our patients has done a lot of work on friendship and relationships and his own identity and what's he looking for, his needs. And then he goes and talks to the other dad at drop off with their kids. And he's like, hey, dude, what's up? You want to go get some coffee sometime or whatever? That dude might be like thrilled. He may be starved for connection. However, he's got to get past like the social anxiety, the novelty of, dude, you're totally violating the bro code here. Like, can we do this? Are we doing this right now? Like, and it may not go well the first time, but usually when there's a second time, they've had a chance to, like, my experience is these guys are out there, particularly these days, and they're starved for it. They're looking for it. It's just, you got to push past the awkwardness.
Right, totally. And the person on the receiving end may not quite be ready or might have so much of that fear that they can't go for it. You know, the other thing I'm curious about is how often do men come to your clinic because their partner has said they need to go or because something has gone wrong? I'm imagining they're not coming in and saying, listen, doc, I have a really hard time identifying and naming my emotions, or I think I have depression or this anxiety disorder. Like, I'm just imagining them coming in and just being like, I mean, I don't really know what's wrong, but my wife said I need to come or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Like one of the top presenting issues that folks will put on their paperwork is my wife is nuts. And I'm like, okay, I've got some assumptions here, but let's flesh those out. For the first time in the DSM-5 PR, for the first time ever, when you look up major depressive disorder, there is a quick note about gender and a depressive presentation for men as externalizers, typically, and for females being more likely to internalize. Now, of course, that's all over the board. But
right,
it's very meaningful to me for those of us that do this kind of work through a gender-informed lens to get to see that. And so for a lot of these guys, what they're experiencing internally, it feels like it's just happening to them because of that intense externalizing frame. And so we have plenty of where it's the partner, the girlfriend, the boyfriend, the family member, whoever it is, like things are falling apart. And his take is, well, I'm doing what I'm supposed to. Like, so for a lot of these guys, it's, I'm going to work, or I'm doing, I'm doing the typical straight out of central casting guy stuff that gets to these days in the wake of a lot more awareness, a variety of different dimensions of identity and being. We can do and be a lot more. And for some guys, this is very liberating and opening. For others, it is incredibly threatening because the expectation is there. Hey, ask for help, be emotionally available, show some empathy and compassion. And I want to put a big asterisk next to compassion, because as far as I'm concerned, that's one of the most important areas to be looking at in practice. But the modeling isn't happening for these guys to do that in such a way where we as a society respect them for it. So it's tricky in that way.
Yeah. So I had reached out to my podcast co-host to see if anybody had specific questions they wanted to ask. And Emily actually was saying, one thing that I hear in my practice all the time is men and dads really want to do things differently, but they don't have a template from their own fathers. And so they're like not really sure how to proceed, right? If I want to be more emotionally available, if I want to be more physically, logistically, available, if I just want to be more involved in doing more, or even in the workplace, there might be, men who say, well, I want to go to more of the games and volunteer at the school and chaperone the whatever. But there's no model at work for that to be okay. And the way that you're going to be judged for being, like not being a guy's guy if you're taking time off of work to go do those parenty things, and how hard that is when you want it, but you don't have the model and you're kind of fighting this uphill cultural battle.
Yeah. And it transcends fatherhood. But one of the reasons that I find early fatherhood a very exciting place in research and practice is I see it as sort of the tip of the spear in this evolution of what society not just thinks that it is to be a man, but what we accord respect for. And there are some pretty brass tacks ways to look at that. Like, the United States is the third worst in the entire developed world for providing parental leave. Of like 170 or some odd countries, we're the third from the very bottom. And that certainly doesn't set the stage for fathers to feel like, hey, I'm an important part of this. But what I mean by the tip of the spear bit is pretty much anybody that you ask and say, hey, is it cool to be an involved dad? The answer will be yes, but there will be caveats. So does being involved mean protect, provide, sacrifice? Like, are you towing the man box line, which is fine. But then ask the question, what about changing diapers, giving a bottle, baby wearing, staying home and not going out or poker or whatever, or being a co-parent where you will accept influence from your partner. And these are very, very new aspects of masculinity, which most people would say, yes, I find that admirable, and sets the guy up for jokes to kind of get taken down a peg or two, even while he's doing the things that we know from research and just kind of walking around in daily life are helpful and beneficial. That's that dynamic tension that I see playing out. I call it the fatherhood generation gap, because the current cohort of dads that are having it are really struggling to sort that out.
Yeah, and there need to be like organizational and systemic changes in order to be able to do those things. And that's such a difficult, slow moving wheel.
Try being the guy that's banging the drum saying we need organizational change and systemic change to support men. That conversation oftentimes gets sidetracked.
Right. Well, yeah. And I mean, I think the idea you were talking earlier about sort of like supporting people of any and all genders. And I think, we all know at this point that these organizational and systemic changes are good for everyone. When you have paternal leave, that benefits women, that fights against sexism and allows men to be more involved dads. I mean, it benefits everybody. Like gender equality, however you look at it, benefits everybody, but it is a slow-moving wheel. Well, while we're on the topic of parenthood, you're an expert on the peri and postpartum period for fathers. And listening to you in other interviews and reading some of the things you've written, I think there are a lot of things about this time that people don't know. So, for example, studies have shown there are hormonal changes in men that are, of course, smaller in magnitude than pregnant women, but they're there. So talk to us a little bit about hormonal changes, postpartum depression, and anxiety, things that I think people will be very surprised to learn.
Yeah. So if this comes up in so I do a lot of trainings around paternal perinatal mental health, or just, the dude to dad transition. And I will regularly get some version of the question, aren't you just blowing this dad's thing kind of out of proportion? Like, maybe this is your thing, but like, and sometimes it will be just as fine a point as, can't you just let the moms have it? Can't it just be maternal mental health? And I'm like, well, there are some particular areas that are exclusively maternal, but the rest of it is parental.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think we need to take a more gender inclusive look at parental mental health. But one of the ways that people will bring this up is to sort of invalidate where I'm coming from is, well, the fathers don't carry the babies. And these days, gestational trans dads are alive and well. In fact, in the area of reproductive mental health, trans reproduction and reproductive rights is one of these like really heating up areas, thankfully. Although, again, back to systemic barriers, but those of us who do this work, who's a cool OB and endocrinologist that can work with a trans dad? Those of us in the trenches know this. But I will regularly get folks who will ask the question like, well, dads can't get postpartum depression because they don't have the hormonal changes and they don't have the, they don't carry the baby. And even for non-gestational dads, male identified parents and the postpartum, about 1 in 10 gets postpartum depression. And not just they're like a little down, they have major depressive disorder with peripartum onset. And it can look sort of like we were talking about earlier with that sort of masked male depressive presentation or not. Even higher than that, about roughly 4 to 18% will develop some kind of anxiety disorder. And again, not just, oh, I'm stressed and, adjusting to this. Generalized anxiety, OCD, PTSD, acute stress, like an actual anxiety disorder in the postpartum period.
And those rates are similar in moms and dads, right?
Yeah, they're more similar than they are, and different than in the community as a whole. Mm-hmm. People get kind of hung up on this hormonal thing, and I'll say, like, look, it is a disservice to anyone who develops postpartum depression, anyone of any gender, to say it is exclusively a hormonal phenomenon. Hormones absolutely neurophysiological changes and neuroendocrine functioning, like, absolutely contribute to one's mental health. Like, nobody's going to go against that. However, there's so much else. Like, the research shows that assuming that the co-parents are still in a reasonably romantic relationship, their perception of their relationship plays hugely, as do different sort of social and systemic aspects, SES, and so on. The thing that's interesting about the hormonal changes, exactly like you said, so all the same changes in the same directions that moms or gestational parents tend to experience is lower testosterone, more cortisol, more estradiol, all the pair bonding, like, vasopressin, oxytocin, and so forth. The fathers experience them in the same direction, but the magnitude is less. And the mechanism seems to be direct, hands-on involvement with the baby. So really, the two rock star researchers in this area, one is Ruth Feldman, and she's in Israel. The other is Darby Saxby, and she's here in Southern California. She's at the University of Southern California. And they have done research that looks from fMRI studies, looking at what parts of the brain for involved versus kind of secondarily involved fathers light up, and then what's their neuroendocrine functioning, and then doing longitudinal research. It's men, so they typically look at testosterone, like how does testosterone functioning at this stage predict subsequent development of postpartum depression? And the short version is, yeah, these involved dads do show changes in the emotional processing and sort of the social aspects of their brain that are what we've seen for many years with gestational parents and moms. And we're seeing that now also with the hormonal functioning. So I'll get these questions like, what if the dad's deployed? Like, what if he's deployed? And then they're talking about the baby. I'm like, I don't know. That's an excellent, but so far,
That's a good
the mechanism is they're involved. When they're not involved, you don't see the hormonal change. But again, to my original point, those hormonal changes are one factor that relate to the development of perinatal mood or anxiety stuff. Look at them, pay attention to them, but you have to look from a biopsychosocial point.
But so are you saying essentially that like when you say involved fathers, like, so if they're bonding with the baby, that's actually protective?
Against mental health?
Yeah. Or did I misinterpret it? Like when you were saying about oxytocin, I'm hearing like the good protective hormones are going to be higher when you're an involved parent. And so is that like protecting against postpartum depression and anxiety?
Most of that research that I'm familiar with is cross-sectional. And so the causality thing, we all get, hit with rulers in grad school. What we know is that being a more highly involved father of an infant, like 0 to 12 months, that goes along with better mental health. But it's a chicken, is it because I'm more mentally healthy, then I'm more involved? And in fact, in our research program, this is one of the questions that we've teased out. Again, ours is cross-sectional, and so we're not answering the causality question. But one of the ways that we've looked at firming up the answer to the question is, what does involvement mean? Right? For some old school, involvement meant you live there and you pay money.
Right.
And you show up down the line when people need to throw balls or learn how to, shave or something. Well, what our research team has done is one of the initial steps we took was to develop a survey, a self-report survey that pulled from the existing literature and theory, worked with a bunch of different subject matter experts to develop a 5-part scale that addresses 5 different, theoretically based, but now we went through it, did all the research about, yes, it's psychometrically valid and good. Father's involvement can look like play, like peekaboo and tummy time and like this, but it can also look like the work. I'm washing bottles, I'm putting diapers on, I'm soothing, I'm swaddling, I'm giving baths, I'm doing all that stuff. It can also look like indirect care, like I'm schlepping the kid over to, a doctor's appointment or some kind of a play date or something, which is fairly different than the others. We also address a kind of involvement that is negative involvement. It's basically irritability or jealousy. Like I feel upset when my baby cries and then I hand it off to my partner. Or we can talk a little bit about like gatekeeping if you want. But like basically, this is a much more nuanced, a much more multidimensional way of looking at father's involvement. And I don't have the answer to what causes more of it. The number one predictor of paternal involvement with infants and babies is the father perceives that his relationship with his partner, with his co-parent, is solid. Like not just our research, like across the whole field, paternal involvement with infants and babies, that is the number one predictor of them having access and being more involved.
That is interesting. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because we know that parenthood can create challenge in even solid, people think like, oh, we're going to have a baby and this is going to bond us and bring us closer and make our relationship better. And the research seems to show that that may happen sometimes, but more often than not, it creates stressors in relationships. And so one of my questions for you was like, what would you want both moms and dads to know about each other so that they can support each other in the best ways possible during this, new or I guess any phase of parenthood?
So again, like, let me put a quick pin in the gatekeeping point, because it factors in very heavily to that research finding about father's perception of the quality of the relationship.
The father's perception. And so gatekeeping meaning I'm a dad who's trying to be involved, but my partner is saying you're not doing it right. You need to do it my way. Is that gatekeeping?
Yes. And in the literature, the actual term is maternal gatekeeping or maternal gate closing. Most of this research is done on het couples and ones in which it's a female gestational parent and so on. And for those of us that do couples work, and certainly in reproductive perinatal, and or you're just a parent and yes, having children is joyful and lovely and terrifying and frustrating. And in parents trying to work it out, how are we going to navigate this? Of course, we come up with deltas. And then how are we going to do this in such a way where there isn't a win-win? And oftentimes that's where it breaks down. So this is, again, back to the controversy. I'm the first person that will point out how men and boys, male identified people broadly, experience power and privilege in society. And I have seen over and over and over again how, as a result of the way that we are typically all socialized to think about early parenthood and pregnancy and babies, that it is the realm of moms and female identified people. Now, the research in this area does not support that. Research basically says gender doesn't make a difference in terms of the quality of the parenting and in terms of the ability to be attuned and attachment and overall child well-being. Some people from different kinds of backgrounds don't want to hear that, but that really is what the research as it relates to gender in the area shows.
But socially and culturally, you're saying there's kind of this like, well, the mom is the one who's going to be breastfeeding the baby. And so what am I supposed to do if I'm not making milk? Like, it kind of starts early in that way of being the mother's domain.
It goes beyond the what am I supposed to do to if mom and dad disagree, mom's right and dad's wrong. But for a lot of these guys, they have tacitly experienced being in a one-up position relative to lots of other groups their whole lives. Mm-hmm. Like in our practice, we see a lot of guys that are in tech that have been upwardly mobile and done their thing. A lot of different ethnicities, certainly being a white guy, like fans the flames of this. But for a lot of these guys, we have enjoyed a sense of being first-class citizens. Like, we're the one in the room that people are kind of looking to or deferring to or something, whether or not we should. Then you get into a perinatal period, and what we're talking about is parenting. A lot of these guys are, for the first time in their lives, having to take a back seat and feeling, and this is the word I hear over and over again, invisible. It's very complicated because maybe they had difficulty with their father figures or stuff that happened in their family of origin. They're kind of catching the gist of, being involved is cool. I want to be pushing the stroller and wearing my baby or whatever. But then when they get to visit during the pregnancy and the ultrasound tech won't answer their question and the person at the front desk just won't even look them in the eye, or the PA that they work with doesn't seem to be taking them seriously, or they're in the hospital and they're not the patient and they feel invisible. For a lot of these guys, that hit to them puts them on a trajectory of disengagement and stepping back. And in some cases, that works. But then you fast forward and you've got a partner that's experiencing the second shift phenomenon, the mental load, the emotional load, and is like, dude, I don't want a direct report. Like, I want a partner. To my way of thinking, well, let's go back. How did this look during pregnancy? Like, were we acting like equal partners during the pregnancy? Well, no, because it's my pregnancy. Right. But it's still the onset of parenthood for everybody. And the biology of it is, of course, what we understand it to be. But I see pregnancy. I mean, the number one predictor of how involved the father is during birth is how involved is he during pregnancy. One of the best predictors of how involved he is in the first year postpartum is how involved is he in the birth. Involvement begets involvement. But right. For a lot of us, the sense is dad's not important, kind of to your point. Dad's not important until, the kid needs to learn how to kick a ball or be assertive or like these things that we associate. And it's a real disservice because then he'll turn around and be like, well, wait, but I was trying to be helpful. I'm asking you what you want. It's like, well, I don't want you to ask me what I want. I'm like, well, that's basically the trajectory of how our co-parenting relationship has gone. And now you're telling me you're dissatisfied with it. That is fine. But I think providing some context helps that couple a bit. Like, how'd we get here?
Right. And no one's a mind reader. Nobody knows what the other person wants or needs. So it sounds like when I asked about what would you want both moms and dads to know and how can they support each other, my guess is that so much of this needs to start with communication and maybe even acknowledging some of these almost hidden dynamics that start early in this very sort of slow and subtle way, but to sort of call it out. right from the beginning?
So as you know, I'm a fairly resource focused and evidence based kind of therapist. So we have tons of handouts. One of them that we've developed for exactly this is called the postpartum game plan. And it's 30 questions that are for expectant parents to come together and ask each other in groups of 5. And there are all kinds of questions like that you wouldn't necessarily be thinking of if you haven't had a baby before. But, they're like, who do you want to be in the room with us? How long until, is the baby going to be in the room with it? When are we going to resume sex? Do you have a lurky uncle that's never allowed to be around the baby? Like, how travel, people coming to visit us, like these sorts of things. And so there's the actual content of the answer, but oftentimes the values and the sensitivities and the boundaries that inform them. And that's why I tell them, go over the postpartum game plan during the second trimester and don't for any reason hold each other to them. The point is, you just want to know where you align and where you don't. You're not signing a contract about what you're going to do afterwards. You do not need to force agreement. You just need to know where you overlap and where you don't.
Right. And they're getting into the practice about talking about it openly right from the very beginning, as opposed to waiting until everything has gone to hell.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, changing that needs to happen sometimes too far down the road. And I don't know if you know if this stat is true or not, because I don't, but I've heard that the divorce rates are still about the same, somewhere hovering around 50%, give or take. But what I've heard is that the number of women choosing to leave in heterosexual relationships, the number of women who are initiating the divorces is much higher. Do you know if that's true or not?
Oh, absolutely. Like the number of women who are choosing not to get married because they want to be independent. Financially, they don't need to. The number of women who are choosing not to remain in marriages or relationships, even where they have a kiddo because it's not meeting their need overall. I mean, contextually, we're 50 years post Title IX. And this is part of what we were looking for, right? For women and girls to be more empowered, to be able to have more opportunities and options, to be able to, call some of their shots and not just be, financially dependent.
But then how much of these like the stereotypes and the ways in which men feel they need to show up in order to be masculine and manly, that's really undermining relationships. And it's not working.
No. And it's changing slowly. Like I say, I see it changing fastest in fatherhood and early fatherhood. But to add on to that stat you just pointed out there, the old trope of, the women are just dying to get married and the men have to be like dragged down the aisle. A lot of these men and fathers who have allowed themselves to essentially let most of their social support go, and they have tried to get all of their needs met by their partner, that contributes to the partner. I mean, the old the nagging wife that doesn't want the husband to go out and do anything and say, that is so much the exception. And these days it's like, dude, SNL, dude park, go make friends, go have coffee with someone, go play basketball, basically go do something, having a light. A lot of times these guys will not push past the anxiety and the awkwardness and the no, bro code. So when the woman is saying dude, I'm out, this guy is desperate for her. He's not like, oh, screw you. He's like, I don't have anybody else. And he doesn't understand his own role in it. So that stat you just threw out, yeah.
And then how much is that negatively impacting men's mental health and interpersonal functioning when now they're alone and desperate and lonely? We should link to that SNL skit about taking your boyfriend to the park. We can link to that. That's it's very, very funny when art imitates life.
Hey, look, he likes video games. Talk to him about video games. You like video games? Yeah. What do you like? And then boom, it's pop. It's funny because it's true.
Yeah, totally. Well, I've loved watching all this work that you've done. You've developed so many cool resources, your basic training for new dads course, your Padre Cadre, and it seems like so much And the group that you talked about in the beginning of the interview, this process group that you do, it seems like so much of what is at the center of the work that you're doing is community. The opposite of the guys that can't go to the park and, meet and talk about video games is like really trying to build a community and create spaces and contexts for men to be able to talk with one another, connect with one another, and learn you're not alone. I mean, I know so many times when my husband has been scared or upset about like how our kids are doing. And I'm like, oh God, they're normal. Everybody's kids are the exact same way. But you don't know that because you don't talk to other dads about it, right? Like all of my women friends and I are constantly talking about the things going wrong. And then you're like, oh, thank God, your kid's doing the same weird thing my kid is doing. And he has experienced a lot more distress because he doesn't have that community, those other dads and men that he can talk to and go, oh, okay, thank God. Your kids are suffering in similar ways too. Am I getting that right? It does seem like community is something that's really at the heart of your work.
So for example, one of the other resources that I have, actually one of the only ways to get in touch with me professionally for free is through. So Postpartum Support International is a nonprofit I've worked with for many, many years. And I've been doing for 12 years the dad's chat with an expert. I'm the expert. I facilitate the call. Is on the first Monday of every month. And it is all about community. It is not psychotherapy. Guys call in from all over the country, in some cases from other countries. And it is a very, unfortunately, astonishingly unique opportunity for fathers of babies and fathers of infants who themselves may be experiencing postpartum depression or anxiety, and or their partners are inpatient for psychosis, or just the relationship is unraveling or whatever, to call in and just hear from other dads who are there or have been there. It's lovely, but it's also kind of heartbreaking to see how difficult it is. So I will oftentimes use that call as sort of a rallying call to guys, there's nothing magic about this. Like, these are other guys that can, and there are other naturally occurring ways that you can find dads with babies. And they don't have to be just those. They can be other. Finding community, like not being isolated. My whole thing is, apart from a romantic partner and family, you need 3 or 4 people that you can connect with. It doesn't matter how socially anxious you are. You can't be too introverted where this doesn't apply to you. It does. You don't have to be working cocktail parties or going and trying to be the life of whatever. You need 3 or 4 of them. And sorry, dude, you're not the exception just because it makes you uncomfortable. Like, I have that conversation all the time.
Right. I love it. Well, we will link to that so people can find that. And where else can people find you if they want to learn more?
So there's our website, the Center for Men's Excellence. It's at www.menexcel.com. We're on social media. And we also I'm the current president of the APA's Division 51, which is the Society for the Psych of Men and Boys. And you can check us out there at division51.net.
All right. Well, thank you, Danny. This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. And of course, it's always just fun to see my friend.
Likewise, it's an honor and it's fun.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.